Hello, everyone, and welcome to 5 Big Questions about the Future of Online Higher Education. I am Sarah Custer, an Associate Editor here at Times Higher Education. So in the next hour or so, our panel will be tackling these questions, but I would like you to get involved. Hopefully on your screen, you should be able to respond to our 5 yes or no questions. Bear with us, this is the first time we're using polls at a THE virtual event, so hopefully you are all able to participate. Please do answer the questions and use the chat function on the platform to expand on your thoughts and tell us a bit more about your opinions. I'll be checking in on the results on those in a moment. I also wanted to let you know that this is a special THE Campus session at Digital Universities Week. If you haven't had a chance to check out THE Campus, please do. There you'll find a wealth of resources about online teaching and learning from people at universities across the world. And you'll also find thought-provoking commentary on the state of digital higher education and what the future of it might be. You can find all of that at timeshighereducation.com/campus. So while people are coming in and taking the poll, I will take a moment to introduce our esteemed panel. Joining me today is Ellie Dommett, a reader in neuroscience and e-learning and an e-learning tutor at King's College London. Rob Freethy is the academic dean of students at the University of Exeter. Alison Littlejohn is a professor and the director of the UCL Knowledge Lab at University College London. And a titan in the world of online education is Sir Tim O'Shea, former principal and vice chancellor at the University of Edinburgh, and now the academic advisor to the digital textbook and e-learning platform Cortex. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining me. I will be checking the chat room to see who has expanded on their thoughts about our questions. And of course, that is also the place where you can engage with our panelists. Please put any questions you might have for them into the chat function, and I'll be checking in on that regularly. Hopefully you've all had a chance to respond to our questions in the poll, and I'd like to pull those results up if possible. For our first one, we have, are traditional assessments fit for purpose in the digital university? 91% of you have said no, 9% of you have said yes. Is the role of the lecturer to be a digital content creator? This one's a bit more evenly split. 55% of you are saying yes and 45% of you are saying no. Do the risks to data protection and human rights of using AI in education outweigh the benefits? Again, a bit more of an even split. 43% of you are saying yes and 57% of you are saying no. Can we stop talking about digital natives? 61% of you are saying yes and 39% of you have said no. And does the future of universities depend on their ability to deliver quality digital education? This is an overwhelming 98% saying yes. So thank you very much for all of you for answering those. Definitely gives us a bit of insight as we go into our conversation. And I see quite a few of you are using the chat function to expand on that. So thank you very much for that. But first, let's go to the panel. I want to hear from you. Rob, I'm going to open up with you. On our first question, are traditional assessments fit for purpose in the digital university?
Yeah, thanks very much. Really interesting to see the results of those polls. I had answered yes and no. I realised you didn't give that as an option to the participants today. And I think the main thing that we can do is diversify the different types of assessment that are available to us. I mean, we can enhance the existing ones, but I think there really is an opportunity to do something very different. And I think that might be things which aren't necessarily moving, it could be moving away from exams. We might have longitudinal forms of assessment. We could have portfolios. We can have practice-based assessment. We've got the opportunity to use different types of media, so visual, audio, image, performance, programming. And I think all of that enables us also to have assessments that are, which people call authentic assessments, that probably relate a little bit more to what happens in the workplace, thereby helping students develop, the sort of vital employability skills that help them, get jobs subsequently. So I think there's lots of new opportunities there. I suppose the reason I was a little bit on the fence is I think there's many forms of traditional assessment that probably can work okay in a new online environment too.
Excellent. Ellie, would you like to come in there? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with much of what's just been said. I think actually the bigger question, which is possibly why so many people answered the way they did, is are they fit for purpose in any university, digital or not? And I think in isolation, the traditional methods aren't fit for purpose anymore, whether that's in a digital university or otherwise. For the reasons that have been said, we need to diversify assessment. We need to move towards authentic assessment. You know, how many graduate employers say, can you write me an essay on this by Monday, rather than can you prepare a presentation, write a blog? I think as well, we need to shift from this assessment of learning towards an assessment for learning. So it's less about this culture of grades. But I think there's another key point that comes out, is that some of the traditional methods of assessment are unintentionally, I think, disadvantaging some minority groups of students. So if we can diversify assessment and introduce blogging, multimedia, website creation, all stuff that the digital university could allow us to do relatively easily, we're also likely to reduce some of the key attainment gaps and potentially then widen participation, which I think is absolutely critical in HE.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thanks for that, Ellie. Really good points on that. Tim, I'm going to come to you. I would like to hear your thoughts on that question, and also perhaps maybe some responses and some solutions to some of the things that have come up in terms of increasing inclusivity whenever we're talking about assessments, making sure that they are testing students on what they've learned rather than perhaps just rote memorization and not really giving us the learning outcomes that we think that they're showing us.
I mean, I would really strongly agree with Ellie. I mean, I think university assessment has been manifestly not fit for purpose for a very long time. It has been testing all sorts of odd bits and pieces. It is not being thoroughly testing the learning process itself. It's not being testing what happens when, happens, as Rob said, on a longitudinal basis. Doesn't properly test what happens when students work in groups. And I think the situation now is just much more stark, in that when you're doing stuff online, it is just very, very clear that the conventional methods we have of assessment, which didn't work very well in the previous environment, are pretty much useless now. We need assessment that is, for example, Google robust. Assessment that makes sense for a learner who can use search engines while they're engaged in constructing their answers and their solutions to problems. And so I think there is a real issue of looking, and I think Sarah is right, we need to be very aware of issues of inclusivity and diversity. There is a real issue of looking at the processes the learner is going through and the processes that are mediated digitally, and then finding ways of helping both the learner themselves understand where they've got to, because one of the functions of assessment is obviously to be formative, to help the learner understand where they are, but also the summative function needs to be there. We need to be able to say, okay, so this person has learned how to be a surgeon or an engineer or whatever, but they need to have learned how to be a surgeon or engineer in the modern environment. You know, surgeons use Google, engineers use Google. They have access to electronically to pretty much all they have learned and thought in the past. So I think there's a real driver, but clearly and to my mind, it is the single biggest challenge in higher education, which is to get to appropriate and meaningful forms of assessment.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that, Tim. Alison, I'm interested to hear your thoughts about our top level question, our traditional assessments fit for purpose in the digital university. I'd also love to hear some of your responses to what speakers have said. And I'm going to give you another one, which is a question that we've got in the chat here, which is asking about A levels. And do you think that therefore there needs to be an overhaul of assessments at all levels, as A levels will surely become redundant in achieving a place at university? So Alison, over to you, please.
Well, I am very much on the yes side of the fence here, in terms of there's a need for a rethink of assessments in higher education in general, not just in terms of digital university. And, you know, as the other panelists have said, it's been known for a very long time, the traditional 3-hour exam assesses specific types of knowledge under specific conditions and is not fit for purpose. And a lot of what I think about assessments has come from my work with employers. Although I will say up front, I don't believe that university education is only about employment. It's about becoming rounded citizens. But employers want to know that graduates can work competently when they join the company. And when I was working with Shell, I did a project with them some years ago, and that they were measuring timed competence, which they believed was growing in terms of the time when a graduate goes into work, and they were selecting some of the best graduates from around the world, to the time when they can work competently without supervision. And that was going from 5 years to 7 years. Now, the reasons are because jobs are becoming more complex, and what graduates need to do when they go into the workforce is changing. There's also something around the half-life of knowledge, but that brings to the fore a second thing that we need to think about when we think about assessment, and that is metacognition. Now, what I mean by that is learning to learn. So being able to not just manage and plan your learning, but having the confidence, the persistence if you don't succeed at first, and so on. So we really need to think about this learning to learn and assessment for learning rather than assessment of learning. So I think there is a need for a rethink in how we assess students. Now, your second question was really about the A-levels, and I guess is related to what we've seen over the past year. So I would point to the Open University as a fantastic example of a university where entry is possible regardless of qualifications. And it's more about the focus on what the students can do when they graduate rather than necessarily, you know, the qualifications they have when they enter. And that, if we know that assessment is not fit for purpose, I think is the right way to make sure that students are entering universities.
Excellent. I just wanted to give maybe Rob or Ellie or Tim, indeed you as well, if anybody else had any other comments that they wanted to make on the issue around A-levels, just considering the past year that we've been through and the conversation that continues going on about those. Any other thoughts on that?
I think if I could, oh, sorry.
Oh, we'll go to Rob first and then I'll go to you, Ellie, please.
Well, I think the key thing about the A-levels, but it could be, you know, any form of qualification, you know, if they are very traditional in their nature, then of course the students have been prepared to undertake and succeed in that form of assessment. And if we then have very different forms of assessment within higher education, we just need to make sure that we sort of transition and induct students into the kinds of knowledge and skills and competencies that we expect them to manifest. So that is an important piece of work that we have to do. But I think it also points to the other side of the fence, which is what are the experiences of assessment that staff themselves have undertaken and to which they are used. Because of course, I think what we need to think here about is also the kind of initial and continuing professional development of staff. If people have been very reliant on those traditional 3-hour end of year or end of degree examinations, and then need to rethink their forms of assessment, that has implications not just for rubrics and marking criteria, but also indeed for the very curriculum they teach in the first place. Ellie,
over to you.
So I think I would have said some things to Rob there, but I think it's a wider issue than assessment in the A-levels. Certainly my experience from the degrees that I've been involved in is the A-level subjects. The students are coming with this very much acquisition. I've learned this information, therefore, or I know this information, therefore I must get an A or an A star. So when they come to university, they're sort of asking you, do I have to learn this sentence of the textbook? And do I have to memorize this for the exam? So I think actually it's not just about overhauling A-levels, it's about turning around and adjusting the whole concept of learning when it gets to that level, that this isn't just acquire this bit of knowledge and regurgitate this fact in order to do well. Actually, it's bigger than that. It's equipping you with the skills to show curiosity, to show lifelong learning. And I think at the moment, A-levels don't do that, which means that even when universities try, it's a very steep learning curve for the students. And I think that's one of the genuine reasons that students are struggling when they transition to university, that what's expected of them at A-level is so different to university in some cases, that they find it a very challenging time.
Yeah, excellent point that you've made there, Ellie. Unfortunately, I think we'll need to move on to our next question, but I'm sure we could definitely have an entire webinar on just kind of the future of assessments, because as Tim said, it is one of the biggest challenges facing higher education providers today. Moving on to our question though about lecturers being content creators. And the question there is the role of the lecturer to be a digital content creator? Now, 55% of our attendees have said yes, 45% of our attendees have said no. I'm interested to hear what our panelists think. Alison, you're not on mute, so I'm going to go to you first.
Okay, my answer is no, but it really depends. It depends on what you mean about content. So from my perspective, lecturers guide and scaffold learning through effective design of learning, whether that's sitting with a student, giving feedback, designing activity for a student to learn a concept, or designing pedagogically sound learning materials, as academics do online. That's not quite the same as content creation. So in the recent article in Times Higher, David Kellerman reminded us that John Dewey said educational communities need three things. So the learner as a cognitive presence, other students as a social presence, and the academic as teaching presence. Over the last year, we've seen academics in campus-based universities switching from face-to-face lectures to video lectures. Now, these video lectures don't provide these three elements. What's really missing is the interaction between the student, between students and with other students, and also with the teacher. In March last year at UCL, we began tracing the experiences of academics and professional services staff as they worked under lockdown conditions. And this is one of the key things, particularly from colleagues who didn't have experience of online teaching. The transition to video lecturing was much more difficult and stressful because the academics didn't have a clear understanding of how to make sure that we have these communities, creating the communities and also enabling the interaction. People tended to therefore create these video lectures as contents rather than designing for learning. And that's partly to do with our academic identity. Lecturers will lecture, and this expectation is mirrored by students who expect lectures. However, we have to really think online about how we enable this interaction.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that, Alison. Rob, I'm going to go over to you. I'd like to hear your thoughts, obviously your response to that question, and also perhaps maybe how the team at Exeter has responded in the past year to the greater need to create content online.
Yeah, so I agree with everything that Alison said. It was really good. And I think we've seen some really, brilliant work by academics creating that content. And I think someone's put it in the chat, that is also different from perhaps curating existing content, other people's content, and then sort of pulling that together into, what might be more like a patchwork quilt. And then the importance then, of course, is making sure that the students navigate that in such a way that it's sort of meaningful and purposeful. I do think I agree strongly with Alison that what we've lacked is that induction into a community of learners, that social aspect, that interactive element. That's been really hard to replicate. And I think that's partly because of the way people have been, using the new tools that have been available to them. And it is really challenging, particularly when you've got very, very large group sizes. You're using perhaps new online platforms. Both staff and students are potentially, new to those pieces of software, not really sure how to get the best out of them. And it's that element that I think is driving people wanting to go back onto campus and have those kind of face-to-face interactions. But if that could be replicated online, and I believe it can be, it just needs a lot more thought and attention than perhaps we were able to, particularly in the early stages of our response to the COVID pandemic. Then I think it is attainable. So yeah, those are my immediate reflections on what Alison said.
Thanks, Rob. Ellie, I'm obviously interested to hear your response to this question, and also perhaps any experiences you've had in the past year in terms of bringing that pedagogy to an online environment.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would just agree with what everybody else has said so far. I think when I answered this question, I said we can only say yes to the question that the lecturer becomes a digital content creator if we only ever thought they scribed on whiteboards or produced PowerPoint slides. And of course, they don't. They do a lot more than that. And I guess an analogy I would use is to say that this is the difference between somebody sort of laying the foundations for a building, so effectively creating the foundations, but not knowing what the building was meant to look like. So the teachers are far more than the person creating the content. Yes, that will be a part of their role, but actually they have to be doing the scaffolding, as Alison said, designing everything around it, and factoring in a significant amount of student interaction, either with their peers or, of course, with staff members. I mean, in the last sort of 12 months at King's, we've seen quite significant changes, I think, and many of which will stay, that are not just about digital content creation. Yes, we produced our shortened versions of lectures and we produced quizzes, but we've also found different ways to interact with students, which I guess arguably is content creation if you're having online discussions through forums and Padlets and all sorts of other things. But I think it is bigger than that. We are dependent. Students have information everywhere. And quite frankly, however good a university can produce a short video clip on the action potential or something, which I teach all the time, probably a commercial company can produce a better, swishier, fancier animation or whatever it is. So our role is not about creating content per se. It is about curating that journey and supporting students along it to take in, which I always equate from the Open University, which has been mentioned already. A good lecturer should be able to take in anyone, irrespective of their educational background, and spit out, for want of a better word, a graduate. And that is far more than digital creation.
Thank you very much for that. Tim, over to you. What are your thoughts?
I strongly agree with the tenor of what my colleagues on the panel have been saying. I mean, you need lecturers or tutors who provide scaffolding, provide support, have a sense of the learner as an individual with particular needs and particular properties. And that is quite different from content creation. And when you're in the digital world, there's no reason why the lecturer has to create the content. There may be a brilliant OER, a simulation out there. There may be a digital textbook. In some organizations, and again, the Open University has been mentioned, the content is created by teams. Teams of academic experts, but supported by editors and illustrators and animators. So I think we really do need to distinguish between the digital content, and if you want really high quality digital content, that is almost inevitably going to involve some sort of publishing and some sort of team. And producing this nice digital object that will be used by thousands from the support of the students, which in the last resort, the support of the students is to do with the particular individual with particular strengths, particular weaknesses.
Alison, did you want to come in on that, or no, sorry, maybe I misread that. Well, one question I want to put to the group, and I take all of your points, that this is about curation, this is about faculty being able to teach any student that comes in. But I think there is a point that should be made here, and I've seen it in the chat a couple of times as well, is that we need to create an environment where lecturers and faculty are supported and that they're trained and they're encouraged to create this, to use this digital content that does exist outside of the university, to curate it and to bring it in and to put that into the scaffolding and the pedagogical knowledge that they perhaps don't have. So Alison, I am going to go to you on this one, and let's just talk a little bit about faculty development and how universities, and especially digital universities, need to do a better job of getting them up to that skill level.
Can I just start by saying, over the past year, I've seen the most heroic efforts from everybody in universities, and unless you work in the university at the front line, you're maybe not quite aware of that. So it's very easy to say, well, maybe we shouldn't have gone so much to video lectures and so on. But I think that for many universities to have gone literally over a weekend from being a campus-based university to teaching students around the world online is a phenomenal outcome, which is fantastic. I think that we have to start thinking about the well-being of everybody on campus and what we've experienced over the past 18 months and what that means. Yes, there needs to be support for academics. A lot of the support that went online, we had professional services colleagues who were amazing in the way that they stepped up. They put on pedagogic content knowledge, so information about how to create videos, make them 15 minutes, you know, all this kind of information. But unfortunately, a lot of the academics were just so stressed and short of time that they weren't really able to go through the process of learning completely new practices. So all of this, I think we need to step back and rethink. There have also been issues around some of the inequalities that we find within the system, which have suddenly been exaggerated, particularly under the lockdown conditions, when a lot of the burden of care, not just for children, but or for elderly at home, but also for students has gone on women, and there have been minority groups who have been disadvantaged. So I think that there's not going to be a quick fix, but whatever the solution is, has to really look much wider than what skills do academics need to learn.
Mm-hmm. Rob, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that question as well, just in terms about faculty development and making sure that it, like as Alison said, everyone's well-being is taken into consideration as we're making this long-term shift to digital.
Yeah, so it's really important. I think some people are putting it in the chat, which is the question of the extent to which academics themselves have responsibility for content creation, or whether or not they're part of sort of wider teams. At Exeter, we hired 60 what we call digital learning developers, who we then distributed across all of the different departments, and they were simply there to sit alongside academics and support them in, you know, uploading things and working out how to use Padlet and Mentimeter and all those different tools and so on. But generally, I think the expectations are, in terms of what academics are ideally capable of themselves, as opposed to requiring support, are rising. And I think that is helped by, you know, better supported tools in terms of better interfaces with better workflows, you know, templated designs where it's possible to populate with little technical know-how, but you basically create a storyboard. And I think there's some really, really good content and products that could be generated. I mean, I had great fun with my own children using a piece of software called iMovies. It was just a template. We took videos, we took films, it gave soundtracks, it had credits. We created our own little movie. It was really good, I promise you. Well, that required no particular digital expertise. I mean, just the ability to use an iPhone. And I think more things like that will come on board, and that kind of support will also enormously help academics and improve the quality of the products they're able to create, as well as enabling them not to be distracted from the core subject matter that lies at the heart of it.
Excellent, thank you for that. I agree. I think that as software develops and it becomes more mainstream, I think hopefully that will just make things a little bit easier and a bit more adaptable to certain work requirements. Let's move on to the next question, which was about the risks, the risk to data protection and human rights of using AI in education. Do they outweigh the benefits of using AI in education? 53% of our attendees have said yes, and 57% of them have said no. Ellie, let's bring you in on this one. What are your thoughts about the use of AI in education?
So I pretty much mirrored the attendees in that I sort of sat on the fence here. I think it's a tricky question because the gold standard of learning would be some kind of personalized learning journey. And for that, of course, we have to profile learners. So we're talking about using algorithms on their data, sometimes their entry and their demographic data, not just their performance within a particular program or qualification. And unfortunately, to date, most of the research in this area has looked at whether the AI performs as we hope, not what the real tangible benefits are for staff, for students, potentially at a higher level for university leaders. So I think actually, before we can really answer a question about cost benefits, we have to start talking to the people whose data we're using and to the people who would be using that data, so the staff and the students in particular. That sort of process has started. So some work was done at Manchester Met, I think maybe 2 years ago, and they looked at it and they found that actually most adults were pretty happy with their data being used for educational purposes, for their own, to support their learning. Similar level of happiness as they were for online shopping, which is quite high. So they were quite happy with that. And they actually felt that it would, I think it was an overwhelming, over 90% felt that it would improve their learning. But I think we have to really see what the benefits are of it in place. And at the moment, we don't have the evidence for that. And I guess the only caveat I would add to that is if there is really likely to be a benefit, can we justify stopping someone have access to that benefit? So I guess it's the flip side of the argument that, you know, is it fair of us to have an AI available and not employ it to leave somebody potentially disadvantaged? So yeah, I think I agree with the mixed response of the attendees.
I think next time we do these polls, I will put a yes/no option for people to choose. Tim, let's hear your thoughts on this in terms of just the risks of AI, and do they potentially outweigh the benefits?
For me, this is a really very straightforward. Artificial intelligence is obviously useful. I mean, my doctorate was a computer program to teach quadratic equations that improved its performance on teaching quadratic equations by looking at the different routes the learners took, so that after it had taught 50 students, it was a better quadratic equation teacher than at the beginning. If we want our systems, and it doesn't really matter whether we're talking about financial systems or educational systems or planning systems, if we want our systems to be more responsive to people's needs, and say in the educational domain, if we want to spot faster the student that might drop out, faster the student that is confused about some fundamental concept, then having machine learning as in the repertoire, and being able to say, oh, just a minute, learners who exhibit this behavior at this stage, we have now learned from the data, are much more likely to drop out before the end of the first term. So for me, it's an absolute no-brainer. The more we use artificial intelligence, the greater the possibility of being more sensitive to learner need. And I don't think there's a choice issue here. I hope this doesn't sound brutal, but software is being developed in all its guises I mean, there's much more artificial intelligence around than you think. Many more systems are learning about you, and you may notice it when you're typing or using your smartphone, that things happen a bit faster than you might expect them to. And the reason they do is because the machines are learning about what it is that you do. So there isn't some magic switch where we could say, oh, no, we don't want this. This is happening anyway. And in my views, in education, we can take very good advantage of it to be more sensitive, to allow us to be more sensitive to the needs of learners.
I'm going to stay with you, Tim, because I want to ask you, just drawing on your wealth of knowledge and expertise on this field, any sort of tips or advice in terms of avoiding any pitfalls whenever it comes to risks to student data or student privacy, or making sure that AI is indeed inclusive of all students on campuses?
I think in educational systems and universities and exam systems need to be very clear and systematic about what data must remain private, totally private to the individual, what data what types of data must be private to the teacher and the individual, what data should be private to the cohort or the classroom, and what data can be public. There isn't an option of saying it is all going to be totally private to the student. It's obviously quite unacceptable for it to be all totally public, because there are things the learner might do or say that they would want their teacher to know, but they might not want next year's teacher to know. So it is a question of being very systematic and disciplined in terms of the rules that your institution has and different grades of privacy, and that needs to be done, and it needs to be done clearly. But there isn't an option called let's not do this at all. The option has to be let's develop appropriate sets of rules, and as it were, it's like an onion. You know, what has to be totally private to the individual, what is available to the teacher, what is available to the class, and so on.
Similar point to one that Ellie made as well about just communicating and being as transparent as possible to lecturers and students about how their data is being used and how AI is being interpreted. Alison, I'm interested to hear your points. This is a focus of your research, so please do tell us, what are your thoughts?
Well, I agree that this is very much a human issue. And last year I published a paper with two colleagues, Bettina Barant and Mike Blakemore, on the potential for AI and big data to provide more effective monitoring of the education systems across the EU. And one of the things that we highlighted was the need to recognize and balance the benefits and risks. I do think some risks are not fully realized, but these have to be balanced against the benefits as AI tools are developed and deployed. There are questions around which body or organization should take responsibility for regulation of AI in education, particularly since AI impacts not just data protection and privacy, but fundamental human rights as well. So one of the issues is that when you bring together public and private organizations, they can operate under different rules and values, and we need to really bring these together. We've seen the impact of the work, for example, the Cambridge Analytica work and others, where the use of AI can go wrong and cannot be in the interests of society and the human. So we need to think about how this could be regulated for education at a transnational level with a global organization taking on this role. And to build better systems, I think there are three things. Well, first, as I said, start with the idea of human rights and social justice as a perspective. I have a colleague in the UCL Knowledge Lab, Selena Namorin, who's doing really groundbreaking work in this area. I would encourage you to look at Selena's work. Secondly, recognize the tension between these ed tech startups in particular, or companies that want to make a profit to continue their work and need to do so, and public education systems that are trying to address some deeper societal issues. These perspectives don't always align. And third, work with teachers to base systems on known problems. Some systems have not really taken into consideration teachers, parents, learners at a really deep level, and systems can inadvertently be developed that actually de-skill teachers rather than helping them to scale up.
Thank you for that very succinct list of 3 points to kind of look out for, Alison. I think that's hopefully some really practical advice. Rob, how is AI factoring into the work that you're doing at Exeter?
I think we have examples where people are sort of dabbling in it, but I do think it's got to be on our roadmap going forward. I mean, I agree with Tim. I think this is, unavoidable, and I think the benefits are such that we have to progress in the direction with all the caution that Alison's suggested. And I wouldn't dream of suggesting I'm an expert in this field at all. I mean, it does seem that there are risks to me as a sort of, I would count myself as a layperson looking at this in terms of data collection, ownership, storage, privacy, and so on. And the key issue will be winning the hearts and minds of students and staff. That the benefits are such that they do outweigh gathering and using this data. And it may be, even if we convince ourselves, it's a harder job to convince students, particularly if we have any instances where the data is being misused or not being handled carefully enough. And you might then sort of get, spikes of interest in social media with students campaigning against this kind of thing. So we have to do it very, very cautiously and carefully. But I can see AI already being used in all sorts of areas. And again, Tim alluded to that, speech and image recognition, search engines, spam filters, product recommendations, and then all those virtual assistants that we so merrily use on our phones and other devices. So I think there's so many opportunities here. And I agree that the obvious one to think about is learner analytics. And we might be using analytics in terms of student behavior to help us think through, academic issues, but also health and well-being ones, targeting interventions on students that particularly need our support. But underlying this, I think, and this mustn't be underestimated, and certainly work we're doing currently at Exeter, is to rethink how we go about collecting data, managing data, and analysing data. It seems to me that that data management piece is the bedrock of future digital transformation. And at the moment, I think as an organisation at Exeter, I don't know whether I speak for other institutions too, we've got loads and loads and loads of data, but we spend half our time cleaning it and cleansing it in order to make it useful. And I do think we need to get better at that, because I think if we don't get that data piece right, then all of those different affordances and usages of it, they just won't work.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Robin. I agree. I'm sure probably quite a few institutions are in a similar boat to you as they're starting to kind of grapple with what they're doing with this mass amount of student data. I'm going to move on to our next question, and I'm going to put it to Sir Tim, considering it is very much from the manifesto on online teaching that was authored by Sean Bain and others while you were Vice Chancellor at the University of Edinburgh. And this is the one: can we stop talking about digital natives? 61% of our attendees have said yes, probably please God. 39% of them have said no. Tim, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's digital natives in itself is just an unhelpful term and should be dropped. But I think we do have to recognize that there is a spectrum of comfort and abilities with using technology, and that we can't just vaguely assume that all 18-year-olds have spent zillions of time on computer games and are going to just be completely comfortable with whatever interface you provide them with. And particularly as in the online world, we go international. Our software is being used by people in different cultures with different expectations of what a system might do. So I think thinking through the various comforts and discomforts that computer use can provide, and trying to identify the people in those positions, and obviously ensuring people are comfortable and can understand that is the right thing to do. But a simple binary, people of a certain age and a certain culture, they're digital natives, and then other people are not, is not helpful. And of course, in terms of diversity and access, again, it is not a helpful binary distinction. I think we need to really focus on the spectrum of skills and affordances.
Ellie, can we stop talking about digital natives?
I would love us to stop talking about them. And I've actually got 3 reasons why I think we need to stop talking about them. I guess firstly, it's how we define them. So a digital native is someone defined as familiar with computers and the internet from an early age. But I think, I collect classic cars. I'm familiar with the carburetor function in my camper van. Can I do anything with it to make my camper van run better? Absolutely not. There's a big difference between familiarity and the ability to harness the power of something. So I think just the concept is actually pretty pointless, which Tim alluded to. I think the other thing is that all the while we are assuming that students, and of course some staff, are digital natives, we are not bothering to train and teach these skills as we might. And when we do so, we do it as an extra. We say, oh, you can sign up for this, you can go and do this. And we've already heard that certainly in the last year, staff were pushed, I think, to breaking point, actually, to deliver any kind of education. But we're hearing a lot across the sector about student wellbeing. And we know that one of the factors that impacts on student wellbeing is workload. So we have a student studying a full-time degree. They're not as digitally literate as we might expect. So they fall at the first hurdle. So they fall trying to complete the assessment rather than because they haven't learned the material, for example. And then we send them off to do further training, adding to their workload and causing them extra stress. So I think the assumption they exist is actually doing more harm than good. And as Tim's already mentioned, it does impact on some of the widening participation and the kind of inclusivity of education. If we want truly inclusive higher education, then we have to assume that digital skills should be taught, developed, and practiced throughout the degree rather than something that turns up ready-made. Because the reality is that we see people turning up saying, yes, I can use Google and sometimes Google Scholar. They can't really do much else with it. So we've got to remember familiarity is not expertise.
Yeah, really, really excellent points there, Ellie. And Rob, I suspect you probably agree, but I want to hear your thoughts and perhaps any sort of ideas that you might have about tackling some of the issues about digital deprivation and how we can encourage students to develop those digital skills.
Yeah, no, those are great points. Ellie said a lot of the sort of things that I was pre-prepared to say. And I think somebody in the chat, I can't see who, has actually also made another point that I was going to raise, which is around this idea of digital natives sort of implies that there's a singular digital domain that they occupy rather than a plurality of digital spaces. And I think that's more the case with different types of hardware, different types of software, all being used for different purposes and so on. And I suppose I'm alert to the mismatch potentially between what income students may be used to and the sorts of hardware and software we actually need them to use in order to progress and succeed on their degree programs. So the example's already been given. How many students use Google Docs rather than Microsoft Word? You know, how many are on TikTok, but they've never written or read a blog? You know, just because they're a competent user of Instagram or Tinder doesn't mean they've got all the kind of creative and collaborative and critical digital skills they need to succeed on our programs. And so I think there's a lot of learning that will have to go on and potentially unlearning, because they may have been using some of the the systems and platforms in ways that aren't actually appropriate within a university setting. So we need to kind of potentially think about a kind of academic digital literacy and not just digital literacy. And I'm thinking here particularly about things like academic reading and referencing and how you use sources in your writing, but even simple things like learning to type with your fingers and not just your texting thumb. These are all very different skills. So yeah, I think there's a lot to do on the issue in terms of inclusivity and accessibility. I think, yeah, we certainly need to be aware of digital poverty and the extent to which people have got different access to the hardware they need, or even the internet connectivity they need. And I think we need to do more as institutions, probably be beyond the financial and the sort of hardship funds and so on, to make sure that we're doing some proper assessments of students and diagnoses as they come in of what their needs are and how best we can meet those.
Excellent points, Robin. And someone has alluded to your mention of the word Tinder. Didn't think that they would expect to ever hear that in a webinar. So congratulations on that one. Alison, can we stop talking about digital natives?
Oh, yes, please. For 10 years, I've been trying to encourage people to stop talking about it. 10 years ago, we published a study in Computers in Education questioning the whole concept of digital natives. I think it was originally raised by Mark Prensky. We did a study. We found that younger students did make recreational use of technologies, as the panelists have said. However, there was no evidence to support the other claims that were made by Prensky regarding students adopting radically different patterns of learning. In fact, we found something quite different, which was that younger students conformed very much to fairly traditional pedagogies. Although they were using technology tools, there wasn't a good integration of the digital literacies that they had with academic literacies. And of course, this triggered some of the work that JISC has been doing over the past 10 years, led by Helen Beetham, about academic and digital literacies. Students' attitudes to learning tend to be influenced by the lecturers. So going back to some of the first questions that we were considering about are lecturers or should lecturers be content providers, is a question that's very much related to how students will respond to teaching in universities. I think it would be misleading to ground arguments for change in teaching and for the digital university solely in students shifting expectations and patterns of learning and technology use. We need to look at this in a much wider sense and certainly get away from this digital natives idea.
Excellent. I'm glad we're all in agreement on that, and some really good comments in the chat on that question. So thanks everyone for that. I'm going to move on to our final question, which I hope then means we can move on to perhaps some questions from the panelists, but I am aware that we are slightly running out of time, which is always the case. Tim, I'm going to go to you on this as our university president in residence. Does the future of universities depend on their ability to deliver quality digital education? And I'm also going to have a follow-up question for you on that in terms of how do you think the hierarchy of higher education is going to be impacted by universities' ability to provide a good digital education in the next 10 years, let's say?
Okay. I mean, I think the answer is not a yes or no, but an up to a point. I mean, Cambridge is making this interesting attempt to play catch up and online. If they fail, Cambridge will still be there. It's got resources, it's got a reputation. So Cambridge, you know, while it's trying to emulate other universities that have been successful in the online, you know, it'll perfectly well survive. I think for, you know, universities that are challenged, so they don't have a powerful brand, they may not be in an urban environment, so students, you know, if universities in an urban environment have a very obvious advantage. You know, if you're in London, well, you know, a few million people can get to you by public transport. Universities that are out in the field somewhere do have to either bring the students to them or be effective in being online and going out. So I think the question depends on the university, how strong its brand is, what its location is, what the capability of its staff is, and what the commitment to teaching is. I think for a lot of universities, it will be very important to be effective online. That's the way they're going to keep, you know, internet. You know, a lot of higher education will become much more hybrid, be much more usual for a student to stay in their home country for a couple of years studying online and then maybe spend the last year at the university they're registered with. And we see patterns like that. And I guess there's an interesting differential. If you look at the top end in the US, you know, MIT, Harvard, Stanford, Berkeley, absolutely no difficulty in charging forward online, using their brand, reaching out internationally. If you look at Europe, then with a few exceptions, you know, like University of Edinburgh would be an exception, the Federal University of London would be another. You know, there are a few of, as it were, in terms of world rankings or whatever, a few of the European ones that are near the top have gone online. The majority haven't. The majority have been to date a little bit precious about doing that. And now, of course, the pandemic has changed things. So places like Cambridge are saying to themselves, well, maybe we ought to get into this business. But I don't think it's, you know, for the universities at the top end, I don't think it's life and death. And in terms of status, you know, status of a university depends on, you know, how many centuries have you got? How many Nobel Prize winners do you have? It depends on quite a lot of, you know, are there particular fields of knowledge where your university, you know, Edinburgh philosophy would be an example, you know, other particular fields of knowledge where the university has made a big contribution. Whether or not you go online successfully in the next decade or two is sort of neither here nor there in that. But certainly there will be some challenged universities, you know, more recent institutions that are in fields who might go under if they don't successfully go online. And then there'll be other institutions who, you know, maybe the students will get a bit annoyed at them because they're not that effective are being online, but they're a good brand, so the students will stick anyway.
Thanks for that, Tim. Just to remind everyone, 98% of you said that yes, the future of universities depends on their ability to deliver quality digital education. Let's go to you, Ellie. We've just got a couple minutes left, so I would like to get everyone's thoughts in on this one. So I'll start with you, Ellie, please.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with what's just been said. You know, the research intensive, strong brand universities are going to survive whatever happens. They've never relied exclusively on their ability to deliver high quality education. And I think it becomes things like the TEF, which we can argue whether it's a good idea or not, start to show us that, you know, some of the universities, the newer universities that perhaps don't have such a good brand are actually delivering outstanding education and wiping the floor with the ones at the top of the research tables. But I think there is another important issue to think about here, and that is that there will always be a call for students for face-to-face teaching. So although digital will be critical for some universities, as Tim has said, there will still be a need to have students on campus because students are driving that need. That's what they want. And then I guess the other thing to say is we've got to remember that higher education universities, these are probably some of the areas with the biggest pathological resistance to change that you could possibly imagine, and risk aversion. And until we can deal with the difficulties around change management and risk aversion in universities, any changes that happen are going to be very, very slow. So any impact on the future of universities is going to be playing out for probably decades to come after this pandemic, I would think.
Yeah, very good point about the future of this and how we can't expect too fast of change, even though we have seen massive change in the past year. Rob, over to you, please. Future of universities and their ability to deliver quality digital education.
Yep, thanks. So I think my answer is yes, like most people. But I also think the future of universities depends on their ability to deliver quality education, whether that's digital or non-digital, if you like. And I think what's been said previously about this sort of the hybrid model, modes of delivery which are combining the best of on-campus and the best of online pedagogies, educator-led courses supplemented by AI-driven tools for assessment and support, programs combining academic and vocational study, perhaps delivered in partnership with employers, promoting lifelong learning, student engagement and experience, bringing together on-campus and remote learners, and then also modes of student representation, students, you know, speaking up for themselves, which combine traditional and potentially new modes of getting those voices heard of increasingly diverse bodies. So I think for a university, certainly like Exeter, probably the future is the blend and the best of that.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Alison, last word goes to you.
I think we always have to think about the students, and we have to think about students in a much broader way than we ever have done. I agree with what the other panelists have said. We need to tailor what we offer in terms of digital to the student. We know that a lot of our students at UCL want to get back to London, they want to be back on campus, but we also know that when they do get back on campus, they won't want things to be the way that they were. They want us to use the digital to allow them the flexibility that they've experienced over the past year.
Excellent. Thank you very much for those succinct final remarks, Alison. And thank you very much to all of our panelists for taking on those 5 big questions and to a very vibrant chat going on in the chat group. Thank you very much, everyone, for engaging with us on this. Appreciate it, and we'll see you next time. Thanks very much.